Imagine a narrow dirt road that disappears into the dark Laurel Hells of Western Virginia, 1877. The kind of place where the sun only finds the ground in thin, sick blades and the wind sounds like something forever trying to get inside the house. Up that road sits a cabin older than the state itself, boards gone silver with rot, windows painted shut by decades of mountain damp. Folks in Morgantown called it the Bird Place, though no one had laid eyes on Elias Bird since the dogwoods bloomed. They had seen his daughters, though, 4 pale, black-haired girls who moved like shadows stitched together, always silent, eyes too old for their faces. People said the Birds married their own kin so often that the family tree grew straight down into the ground instead of up toward the light. People said a lot of things. Most of them were worse than the truth. None of them came close. Beneath that cabin, under a trapdoor hidden by a braided rug and 16 years of filth, there was a root cellar cut straight into bedrock. Cold as a grave even in July. And for 6 straight months in the year of our Lord 1877, something that used to be a man, something that had once answered to the name Elias Bird, was chained to the wall down there with wagon trace chains and a logging collar rusted black with old blood. He was fed spoiled cornbread and creek water, just enough to keep the rats interested. He screamed until his voice shredded, then whispered, then only moaned like a dying dog whenever boots crossed the floorboards overhead. Those boots belonged to his own daughters. The same girls he had raised with a leather strap and something much worse. The same girls who finally decided that some debts could only be paid in the dark, one slow heartbeat at a time. When the law finally came, they found Elias curled in his own waist, beard grown down to his waist, eyes milk-white and wide, repeating the same words over and over like a prayer no God would ever answer. They're me, Lord Jesus, they're me. In the spring of 1859, Elias Bird rode into the Monongahela Valley with a new wife clinging to the saddle behind him and a deed folded inside his coat that no living soul had ever seen him earn. He was 28, she barely 17, both of them carrying the same sharp cheekbones, the same winter-pale skin, the same black hair that caught blue highlights in the sun like crow feathers. Her name had been Miranda Bird before the preacher ever spoke over them, because she was Elias's first cousin once removed on his mother's side. The family had always preferred to keep land and blood in the same hands. They came from the older, meaner ridges farther south where the war had not yet started but everyone already felt it breathing down their necks. Elias had sold the last 40 acres of his daddy's tobacco ground for a pittance and bought 200 acres of near-vertical wilderness outside Morgantown, land so steep the county surveyor had marked it unfit in his ledger. Didn't matter. Elias wanted distance. He wanted a place where no road reached in winter, where no church bell could be heard, where the only law was whatever he carried in his own house. He built the cabin himself that first summer, felling chestnut so ancient the trunks rang like iron when the axe bit. Miranda cooked over an open hearth while mosquitoes the size of hummingbirds rose out of the laurel thickets in clouds thick enough to choke a horse. Neighbors, there were only 3 families within 5 miles, came once to raise the roof beams and never came again. Something about the way Elias watched them, something about the way Miranda never spoke unless Elias spoke first, something about the identical, unblinking grey eyes they both turned on visitors like they were sizing livestock. By the time the first frost silvered the ridges, the cabin stood finished, 1 room and a loft, a stone chimney that drew poorly, a door so low a tall man had to duck. Beneath the puncheon floor Elias dug a root cellar into the hillside itself, walls sweating cold water even in August, ceiling so low a grown man could not stand upright. He told Miranda it was for apples and turnips. She nodded the way she nodded at everything, lips pressed thin, already carrying the first child that would be born dead the following March. Word traveled slowly down the muddy tracks into Morgantown that the Birds had arrived and meant to stay. Folks spoke of them in the way people speak of a sudden storm on a clear day, half warning, half fascination. They said Elias had the old bird look, the one that came from too many marriages signed in the same family Bible. They said his young wife looked more like his sister than his bride. They said the hollow he'd chosen swallowed sound, that dogs refused to cross the creek below the cabin, that on still nights you could hear something laughing up there that didn't sound quite human. No one knew then how true the whispers were, or how much worse the truth would become. April 1861 came in with cannon smoke drifting all the way from South Carolina, and every able man in Monongahela County felt the pull of one flag or the other. Militia captains rode the ridges with rosters in their saddlebags, promising glory or vengeance depending on which way a fellow leaned. When they knocked on Elias Bird's low door, he met them on the porch with a Spencer carbine across his crooked arm and a look that made the horses sidle. He told them he had bone spurs in both heels, then told them his wife was sick, then told them the Bible said a man's first duty was to his own hearth. The captains wrote his name once and scratched it out. After that, no one came back. While Virginia tore itself in half and the new state of West Virginia bled into existence almost every creek bed, Elias simply disappeared deeper into his hollow. He cut a second trail only he knew, a deer path that climbed the backside of the ridge and let him slip down to the river road when he needed powder or salt. He grew adept at being unseen. Travelers on the turnpike would swear no cabin sat up that laurel-choked trace, even when smoke rose straight above the trees. Miranda's belly swelled again that first winter of war, and the isolation tightened like a snare. Snow sealed the hollow for weeks at a time. The creek froze solid enough to drive a yoke of oxen across. Elias hunted deer by moonlight and jerked the meat until the rafters sagged with it. He brewed mash in the root cellar where the cold kept it from souring too fast, ran it through a copper worm he'd traded a neighbor's widow for without ever showing his face. The liquor came out clear and mean, strong enough to strip paint, and he drank it the way other men drank water. By 1863 the war had turned the entire valley into a hunting ground. Bushwhackers in butternut, home guard in blue, deserters wearing whatever wouldn't get them shot, all of them passed within earshot of the bird cabin, none ever found. Elias watched them from the ridge with a spyglass he'd taken off a dead Yankee lieutenant, marking which side looked weaker that week. He sold venison and moonshine to both, always at night, always for gold or lead, never for paper money he called shinplasters. Miranda gave birth alone in the loft to a girl they named Delphia while cannon echoed faintly from the Cheat River line, 40 miles away. Elias cut the cord with his skinning knife and went straight back to his still. The war raged on, taking brothers, husbands, whole counties, but up in that laurel hell the only clock was the seasons and the only law was Elias. The cabin grew darker, the paths more overgrown, the silence thicker. 4 more times Miranda's body would rip itself open to bring forth daughters who looked more like their father every year, while the country outside burned and rebuilt itself without ever noticing the bird place had vanished from every map but one. The years after the surrender at Appomattox did not bring peace to the bird cabin. They only removed every last excuse for the outside world to come looking. The war had ended, roads were being mended, tax collectors and census men began creeping back into the hollows, but none of them ever climbed the laurel-slick trace to Elias's door. Perhaps the dogs snarled too loud, perhaps the rifle barrel that glinted from the loft window was warning enough, or perhaps the hollow itself seemed to breathe out a warning older than muskets. Miranda's body, already worn thin by isolation and cornmeal and Elias's fists, began to fail in earnest after Delphia's birth. She carried 3 more daughters in 4 years, Malvina in the spring of 1868, Serena in the bitter January of 1870, and Corinne in the autumn of 1873, each labor harder than the last, each child smaller, paler, more silent. The girls came out looking less like babies and more like miniatures of their father, the same narrow skull, the same flat gray eyes that caught light the way a knife blade does. Miranda's hair, once thick and black as Elias's own, turned the color of ash and began falling out in clumps. She stopped speaking entirely the winter Corinne was weaned. Elias marked the births the way he marked notches on a tally stick for deer killed, quick slash with a skinning knife on the loft beam, no celebration, no preacher, no names spoken in daylight until the child lived long enough to be useful. The older girls learned early to keep quiet when their mother screamed, to hide in the loft with their thumbs in their mouths while Elias paced the floorboards with a jug in one hand and the leather trace in the other. They learned that blood on the puncheon floor could be scrubbed away with lye before sunrise, that bruises faded if you stayed out of the light, that hunger was better than the alternative. Corinne's birth broke Miranda clean in half. The bleeding would not stop. Elias sent Delphia, barely 7, running barefoot through a cold October rain to fetch the granny woman 3 ridges away, but by the time the old woman arrived Miranda was already cold. They wrapped her in the only clean quilt and herded her down the slope at dusk. Elias dug the grave himself with a mattock, cursing every shovelful because the ground was iron-hard with frost. When it was done he stood over the mound and spat, then turned back to the cabin where 4 small girls waited in a silent row on the doorstep, huge eyes reflecting the pine knot torch like animals caught in a trapper's light. From that night on, the cabin belonged wholly to Elias and the daughters he had made in his own image. The door stayed barred from the inside even in summer, the windows shuttered even at noon. For little girls grew into 4 silent, watchful girls who moved through the rooms like smoke, speaking only when spoken to, and then in whispers. The hollow closed tighter around them, laurel thickets knitting together until the sky itself seemed lower, heavier, older. And beneath the floorboards the root cellar waited, dark and patient, its stone walls already tasting what was coming. With Miranda gone, the cabin shed whatever thin pretense of gentleness it had ever worn. The years 1873 to 1876 passed like fever dreams, each colder and longer than the last, and Elias Bird became the only son the 4 girls ever saw. He rose before dawn, kicked the nearest child awake to build up the fire, and drank the first cup of scalding rye before the coffee had even boiled. By the time Delphia turned 10, she could skinning deer, churning butter, and swinging a double-bitted axe with hands already scarred white. Malvina, 2 years younger, could read the weather in the ache of her knees and knew which roots killed pain and which killed everything else. Serena and little Corinne followed behind like pale ducklings, learning early that silence kept their faces turned away from Elias's gaze. The abuse did not announce itself with trumpets, it simply became the air they breathed. A backhand for a slow answer, a boot in the ribs for milk spilled, the leather trace laid across bare shoulders for imagined disrespect. But the worst of it happened after the nights Elias drank the still warm liquor straight from the worm. Then the cabin door was barred, the shutters latched, and the girls were sent one by one or sometimes 2 together to the loft where the rafters still carried the notches of their berths. They learned to lie perfectly still, to breathe through their mouths so the floorboards would not creak, to stare at the same patch of black mold on the roof shake until the world narrowed to a single point of nothing. Elias never spoke of love, never offered comfort, never explained. He simply took what he believed was his by right of blood and strength. The girls grew thinner, quieter, their eyes taking on a flat shine like river stones rubbed smooth by years of current. They stopped flinching after a while, flinching only made it last longer. Instead they developed a stillness so complete that rabbits would feed in the yard without noticing the 4 pale shapes watching from the porch rails. Neighbors, what few there were, saw smoke from the chimney and sometimes glimpsed the girls hauling water or chopping kindling, always barefoot even in frost, always together. Folks told themselves the Birds were just private folk, clannish like all mountain people, and looked away. The census man came once in 1875, left after Elias met him at the gate with a shotgun across his forearms and the dogs straining at their chains. After that the hollow was officially empty on every map. By the winter of 1876 the girls moved through their chores like sleepwalkers, hands raw, mouths set in identical thin lines. They had learned to hide food in the rafters, to steal sips of water when Elias slept off the rye, to bind each other's cuts with strips torn from their own shifts. They had also learned something else, something that settled in their bones like frost, that the man who ruled their days and nights was not immortal, that chains were not only for dogs and prisoners, that revenge could be as patient as stone. And beneath the floorboards the root cellar waited, colder than any grave, already tasting the shape of what was coming. January 1877 arrived on a wind sharp enough to slice bone. The creek froze so hard the girls could walk across it to fetch firewood without breaking through, their bare feet leaving prints that looked black against the ice. Elias had been drinking for 3 straight days, ever since he traded the last of the smoked hams for 2 stone jugs of his own moonshine run twice through charcoal. The cabin stank of sour mash, sweat, and the greasy smoke of a fire fed with green wood because no one had dared go out to split the seasoned oak. Delphia, 17 now and already taller than most men in the county, stood at the hearth trying to coax a pot of dried beans to soften before Elias woke. Her hands shook. The night before he had dragged her down from the loft by the hair because she had dared to pull away when he reached for her. The left side of her face was swollen purple, one eye sealed shut, lips split to the teeth. When the jug on the mantel tipped and rolled, spilling a thin stream of liquor across the puncheon floor, Elias came awake with a roar that rattled the tin plates on their pegs. He was on her before she could step back, fist, boot, the heavy jug itself, whatever came to hand first. The first blow split her eyebrow, blood poured hot down her cheek. The second drove her to her knees. She curled around the pain like a pill bug, arms over her head, waiting for the storm to pass the way they all had 100 times before. But this time something inside Delphia broke open instead of folding shut. She felt Malvina's hand on her shoulder, Serena's small fingers clutching the hem of her skirt, Corinne's breath hitching behind her. She heard the wet click of Elias working his belt free, smelled the liquor sweat rolling off him. And in that moment the years of silence, of stillness, of swallowing screams until her throat bled, turned into something bright and sharp behind her eyes. When Elias raised the jug to smash it across her skull, Delphia moved. She came up from the floor like a wildcat, driving her shoulder into his gut, teeth sinking into the meat of his forearm until she tasted blood and sour whiskey. He howled, staggered, and for one impossible heartbeat the cabin belonged to the girls. Malvina snatched the iron poker from the hearth. Serena grabbed the butcher knife they used for hog killing. Even 9-year-old Corinne picked up the splitting maul that weighed almost as much as she did. They did not speak. They did not need to. The sound Elias made when the poker took him across the knees was not human. He went down hard, head cracking against the hearthstones, and the girls stood over him breathing like horses run too long. Blood dripped from Delphia's face onto his beard. No one moved to help him. For the first time in their lives the cabin was perfectly, absolutely quiet except for the pop of burning fatwood and the slow, wet sound of Elias trying to remember how to scream. Something new had been born in the smoky air, something that had been waiting under the floorboards all those years. It looked out through 4 pairs of grey bird eyes and it was very, very hungry. March 1877 thawed just enough to turn the ground to sucking mud, but the night still carried the bite of winter. Elias lay unconscious on the bloody floor for the better part of 2 days, skull cracked, one knee swollen to twice its size, breath rattling like loose beans in a pod. The girls moved around him the way deer move around a downed bear, quiet, watchful, waiting to see if it would rise again. When it finally did, groaning and cursing through cracked lips, they were ready. Delphia and Malvina took his arms, Serena and Corinne his legs. He was heavy, drunk, weak and feverish, but surprise gave the girls the edge of madness. They dragged him across the floorboards while he thrashed and spat, boots scraping furrows in the old pine. The braided rag rug flipped back like a trapdoor springing open, revealing the iron ring Elias himself had set into the puncheon years before. Beneath it lay the root cellar stairs, 12 steep steps cut into living stone, each one slick with frost and centuries of damp. They hauled him down backward, his head bouncing off every tread. The air changed as they descended, warm flesh meeting the cold breath of the earth. The cellar was barely cleared 6 feet at its highest. Elias's boots scraped sparks from the ceiling when they turned him. In the far corner, half buried in coal slack and potato dirt, lay the relics he had bragged about in his cups: a set of slave irons taken from a burnt-out plantation during the war, wagon trace chains thick enough to hold an elephant, a logging collar meant for the meanest milliard ox, all of it orange with rust and black with old blood. Corinne, small as she was, worked the key they had stolen from Elias's pocket months earlier when he passed out by the fire. The shackle snapped around his left ankle first, then the right, chain run through an iron ring bolted into bedrock before the cabin itself was ever raised. Collar went on last. Malvina had to stand on his chest to force the hasp closed while Delphia held his beard back so the rusty edge would not cut. When the padlock clicked shut the sound echoed like a church bell in that stone box. Elias came fully awake then, eyes rolling white, voice raw from screaming threats that turned to pleas and then to something worse, something that sounded like a child begging its mother. Girls did not answer. They climbed the stairs single file, pulled the trapdoor down until the iron ring clanged into place, and rolled the cookstove over it so nothing below could ever push it up again. Above, the cabin fell silent except for the slow drip of blood from Delphia's split brow hitting the floor. Below, the first sob rose, muffled, wet, endless, already tasting the dark that would last 6 full months. Spring came late to the hollow that year, as though the mountains themselves were reluctant to let the light touch the bird place again. Dogwoods bloomed blood-red along the creek, but inside the cabin the shutters stayed barred and the chimney gave off only thin, cautious smoke. The 4 sisters moved through their days with the calm of women twice their age, rising before dawn, feeding the hogs, hoeing the corn, drawing water as if nothing below their feet weighed 300 pounds and screamed itself raw every night. They fed Elias the way a body feeds a leech, just enough to keep the wound open. A tin plate of cold cornbread soaked in creek water, a rind of fatback gone green, apple peelings, whatever scraps the hogs would not eat. Delphia lowered the bucket on a rope through a knothole they had bored beside the stove, letting it down until the chain below jerked and rattled like a dog coming to the end of its run. Sometimes he cursed them in a voice shredded to ribbons, sometimes he wept and called them his little darlings, sometimes he only made wet clicking sounds with what was left of his tongue after he bit through it trying to chew off his own wrist. When travelers or the rare peddler came within earshot, the girls stood on the porch in a silent row, sunbonnets pulled low, hands folded, staring until horses shied and men found urgent business farther down the trace. To the mail rider who asked after their daddy they answered in perfect unison, sweet as chapel bells, Pa went south to nurse the fever with kin in Carolina. Left us to keep the place. Their eyes never blinked, never wavered, and something in those flat grey eyes made the man spur his mule so hard it threw a shoe before he reached the river. Inside, the cabin grew strangely clean. The girls scrubbed blood from the floorboards until the pine shone pale again, hung dried apple rings from every rafter, whitewashed the hearth. They sang while they worked, low mountain hymns their mother had whispered before her voice gave out, the notes drifting down through the floorboards to mingle with whatever sounds rose from the dark. At night they slept four to a bed like nested spoons, breathing in unison, waking at the slightest shift of weight on the stove above the trapdoor. By midsummer the laurel had grown so thick the cabin could barely be seen from the ridge. The sisters' dresses hung loose on sharpening bones, but their hands were steady when they sharpened the scythe or poured shot into paper cartridges. They had learned the rhythm: work, feed the thing below, listen to it weaken, sleep. 6 months felt like 6 minutes and 6 lifetimes both. And every evening, when the whippoorwills started and the air cooled enough for the stone walls to sweat, Delphia would lay her cheek to the floorboards and whisper through the cracks the same promise, soft as a lullaby. Not yet, Daddy. Not yet. August 1877 burned the ridges brown and turned the creek to a chain of warm, stagnant pools. The air itself seemed thick with punishment, pressing down on the cabin until the shingles curled. A circuit-riding preacher named Obadiah Greathouse came riding a sway-backed mare up the forgotten trace, black coat bleached grey with dust, Bible tied to his saddle with rawhide. He had been warned in Morgantown that the bird place was godless ground, but Obadiah had buried 3 wives and 1 child to the fever and no longer feared much on this side of the grave. The girls met him at the gate the way they met everyone, 4 pale figures in washed-out calico, barefoot, silent, staring. Corinne, now 10 but small as a 7-year-old, held the hound by its leather collar. The dog strained and snarled though its ribs showed sharp. Obadiah tipped his sweat-stained hat and asked leave to water his horse and speak a blessing over the house. Delphia's one good eye flicked toward the cabin. The stove inside sat slightly askew, a darker rectangle on the floorboards where it usually rested. She nodded once. While the mare drank from the trough, Obadiah walked the yard reciting the 23rd Psalm in a voice cracked from years of shouting down sinners. He had reached the valley of the shadow of death when the wind shifted, carrying a smell that made the horse throw its head and blow. Not outhouse, not dead possum, something sweeter, deeper, older. Obadiah paused mid-verse. From beneath the cabin came a sound too faint for words, more vibration than voice, a low, steady keening that rose and fell like a woman rocking a dying child. He stepped onto the porch uninvited. The girls moved to block him, but he was already past, boots thudding across the puncheon floor. When he laid his palm to the cookstove it was cold, no fire for days, and beneath it the boards gave the slightest tremor, as though something large breathed against them from below. The preacher's face went the color of tallow. He demanded to know what they kept under the house. Delphia's mouth opened, closed, opened again. For the first time in months her voice cracked like thin ice. Rats, she whispered. Big ones. Obadiah Greathouse had stared into too many graves to be lied to by a 17-year-old girl. He drove his mare down the mountain so hard the animal foundered before it reached the river road. By nightfall he was pounding on the sheriff's door in Morgantown, coat torn by Laurel, eyes wild, telling a story no one wanted to believe until he dragged the deputy and half the town watch back up the trace with lanterns, crowbars, and rifles loaded for bear. The girls heard the dogs and the hooves long before the torches appeared through the trees. They stood on the porch in the same silent row, hands clasped in front of them, moonlight washing the blood from their faces until they looked carved from bone. And under their feet the thing in the cellar began to laugh, a wet, broken sound that carried all the way to the ridge and made the horses scream. September the 12th, 1877, broke cold and clear, the kind of mountain morning when every leaf looks edged in new steel. 23 armed men, sheriff, 2 deputies, the town doctor, the preacher, and a knot of farmers who had brought their squirrel rifles more for courage than need, rode single file up the laurel trace at dawn. The dogs refused to leave the wagons, whining and tucking tail the closer they came. When the cabin came into view, the only movement was thin wood smoke curling from the chimney and 4 pale girls sitting on the porch steps like dolls someone had lined up and forgotten. Delphia rose first, hands folded, chin high, the bruise from January now a faint yellow shadow across her cheekbone. Behind her Malvina, Serena, and Corinne stood in perfect descending order, barefoot, hair braided tight, eyes reflecting the torches without blinking. The sheriff called Elias Bird's name 3 times. No answer except the wind worrying the shingles. They found the cookstove dragged aside and the trapdoor already lifted, propped open with the splitting maul. A rope ladder, new hemp, bought in Morgantown the previous spring, hung down into the dark. The smell that rolled up the ladder made 2 men retch on the spot and the doctor pull a camphor-soaked bandana across his face. Lanterns lowered first, then the sheriff himself, then the doctor. The cellar was worse than imagination. Elias Bird, or what was left of him, crouched in the far corner, naked except for the iron collar and the chains that had worn grooves into his ankle bones. His beard reached his waist, matted with filth and his own hair where he had torn it out handfuls. Skin hung from his frame in grey folds, ribs showed white through sores that never healed. His eyes were filmed milk-white, yet they moved, tracking the light like a blind animal sensing heat. When the sheriff spoke his name, Elias flinched and tried to crawl backward, chains clinking, dragging furrows through the coal slack and human waste 6 inches deep. A tin plate lay just beyond his reach, licked shiny. From his cracked lips came a steady whisper, the same words over and over, barely air. They're me, they're me. Lord Jesus, they're me. The doctor knelt, touched the man's neck, and recoiled as though burned. Still alive, he said, voice shaking. Barely. They carried him up on a split-rail door because no stretcher would fit through the hatch. When sunlight struck his face he screamed, one raw, animal note, then folded into himself and began rocking, chains rattling like death bells. The girls watched from the porch without expression while the men wrapped Elias in horse blankets and lifted him into a wagon. Not one of the sisters moved to help, not one shed a tear. Only Delphia spoke, so softly the sheriff had to lean close to hear. He fell down the stairs in March. We couldn't get him out. The lie hung in the cold air like frost that would never melt, while beneath the cabin the root cellar exhaled once, slow and satisfied, and settled back into silence. October 1877 turned the Monongahela Valley gold and crimson, but the Morgantown courthouse stayed gray with crowds from first frost to killing frost. People rode 50 miles over wagon roads still rutted from war to watch the trial of the Commonwealth versus Delphia, Malvina, Serena, and Corinne Bird. The galleries filled before sunrise, women fainted from the press of bodies and the smell of camphor and unwashed fear. Newspaper artists from Pittsburgh and Cincinnati scratched frantic sketches of the 4 sisters seated in a row on the prisoner's bench, hands folded, faces so alike as nested spoons, eyes never leaving the American flag behind the judge's chair. The prosecution called it the most cold-blooded crime in the history of the new state. They paraded the chains, the rusted collar, the tin plate licked to a mirror, the doctor's photographs of Elias's ulcerated legs and the grooves worn into living bone. They read from his statement, 3 pages of scrawled madness that began "My own flesh ate me" and ended with nothing but the words "they're me" repeated until the pencil snapped. They brought in neighbors who swore the girls had always been strange, that dogs crossed the road rather than past the cabin, that no one had seen Elias since the snow melted. The defense lasted 1 afternoon. A young Charleston lawyer with trembling hands put the sisters on the stand one by one. Delphia spoke first, voice flat as river ice, recounting every beating, every night dragged to the loft, every year of hunger and silence. Malvina followed, then Serena, then 10-year-old Corinne, who had to stand on a crate so the jury could see her face when she said, "He made us bleed where babies come from." The courtroom went so still the scratching of the reporters' pencils sounded like rats in the walls. 3 doctors, 2 from Philadelphia, 1 from Baltimore, testified about the shape of the girls' skulls, the overlapping teeth, the shared deformities of hands and spine that proved generations of cousin marriage. They called the sisters moral imbeciles created by their father's sins long before they ever laid a hand on them. The preacher Obadiah Greathouse took the stand in tears and said the devil himself had lived in that hollow and the children had only done what children do when left too long in darkness. After 4 days the jury stayed out less than an hour. Guilty on all counts, but the foreman stood and begged the judge for mercy. "Hang them and we hang the only witnesses to a worse crime." The judge, old, shaking, eyes red from sleepless nights, sentenced the Bird sisters to life in the Weston Lunatic Asylum at Weston. No gallows, no cheers, only a low sound like wind moving through dead leaves as the crowd filed out. They left the courthouse in a closed wagon, 4 pale faces pressed to the barred window for one last look at the mountains. Behind them Elias Bird lingered 3 more weeks in the county infirmary, refusing food, whispering to anyone who would listen that his daughters wore his face under their skin. When he finally died, they buried him in the potter's field with no marker. The cabin burned to the ground the following spring, cause unknown, and the hollow grew shut with laurel so thick that within 10 years even hunters could not find the trace. Only the root cellar remained, stone walls sweating in the dark, waiting for the next debt only blood can pay.